So I will continue the conversation about the importance of research and also the importance of teachers and their professionalism in education reform. And before I get to some of the research and the data, I wanted to make 2 points that already both David and Alan highlighted in their presentations, and I will try to also carry the threads through my presentation. And one point is that regional comparisons are very necessary, and as much as comparisons to the West, whether it's Western Europe or North America, are important, I think equally important and maybe even more important are also comparisons in the region. And actually national comparisons too, where we can disaggregate the data and look at what happens in education in different parts of the country. But what happens, I think these comparisons of Kazakhstan, for example, against Central Asia or the Caucasus or the former Soviet Union are also very important and can tell us a lot about where the different educational systems are moving. So I would encourage you to continue to do those comparisons and not only rely on large cross-national data, but actually dig deeper. Another point that I will try to make, and that's the point that David was also making, is that it's also very important to look at the broader picture and not only look at what happens in the school when we implement reforms, but also look at what happens outside of schools. And what are some of the factors outside of the educational system that also impact how reforms get implemented. And this is perhaps then an introduction to my topic. What I will try to do today, I will try to take a broader picture at the education reform, and I will start by looking at something that happens outside of school. I will primarily look at the study of private tutoring, and I will look at tutoring as a so-called barometer of education reform, and try perhaps ask a question: what can we learn from private tutoring about what happens inside the schools? What can it tell us, as a barometer tells us sometimes about the temperature outside? And before I get to this data on the studies of private tutoring, I will very briefly also look at the broader context within which the reforms in Kazakhstan, but also in the region of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Central Europe are happening. And we are all familiar with, these fairly difficult conditions in which education reforms in the post-Soviet, post-socialist region had to be done. And these conditions included the declining state expenditure on education and increasing private spending on education. For example, we have seen the introduction of formal fees in schools, in universities, and at non-compulsory education levels in many countries. We also have seen the increase in community contributions toward the financing of local schools, sometimes fees for school maintenance and repairs, which are very common in schools in the region. We also see that schools increasingly ask students to pay for textbooks, for school meals, for extracurricular activities. We also see payments for complementary requisites such as clothing, shoes, transportation, and also we see informal payments in public schools, such as payments for private tutoring, or sometimes also payments for grades. And so I'm not speaking about Kazakhstan here, I'm talking about some of the regional data, all right? At the same time, we also see the decreasing teacher salaries in the last couple of decades, and actually the salaries have fluctuated in many countries. Now teacher salaries have been going up, but still in very many countries, for example in Azerbaijan or in Tajikistan, the teacher salaries are still at the poverty level and sometimes even below the poverty level. We also see the changing quality of education in public schools, and I think some of the PISA data shocked some of the countries in the region with the results, especially countries like, well, actually both Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan in the past. And we also see increasing demand for higher education. So there are lots of factors that influence how that influence the context within which school reforms are happening. And within this picture, we also witness very often the deteriorating social status of teachers and the declining authority of teachers. And this comes from personal conversations with many teachers that I have worked with in the region, but it also appears in very many publications, and actually it's referenced in many national reports on education as well. That teachers are no longer can enjoy the high status that they had during the Soviet times. And I just wanted to remind you, just bring up some of the posters from the Soviet times that highlight this very high status that the teachers enjoyed during the Soviet period. I think that these are some of the familiar pictures to many of you probably. And partially that high status depended on salaries, but there was also a very strong sense of professionalism and authority that teachers enjoyed during the Soviet period. And some may argue that perhaps these posters are really more a myth, something, and perhaps maybe nostalgia that some of us may have for the Soviet times, but there are in fact very many comparisons these days in publications that do look back at what was it about the teaching profession during the Soviet period that made teaching a respected profession, and why this respect and authority has been lost in some countries during the transition period. And so this will be my transition to the study on private tutoring. And so you see here a picture of an empty classroom, and this is in fact something that we have experienced when we conducted the study on private tutoring in 12 countries of the former Soviet Union and Eastern and Central Europe. In fact, a national study on private tutoring in Azerbaijan was called Empty Classrooms, because when we went to speak with some of the teachers who also work as tutors after school hours, when we went during the school hours to visit them, we realized that actually the teachers were not in schools, and then the students were not in schools either, because neither the teachers nor the students believed that going to school was worthwhile. They, in big masses, left the school and instead had private tutoring during school hours, all right? And so this raised really interesting questions, and so we really wanted to dig deeper to understand what is it that drives teachers into private tutoring and out of schools, all right? And this is just one example. I think probably many of you also have heard examples of your friends or acquaintances or colleagues who have left the teaching profession in the last couple of decades for various reasons. You also probably have heard about students that are really not encouraged going into the classrooms anymore, or not really interested in pursuing the teaching professions. And there are some interesting studies on those issues as well. So, but the question is, what drives teachers away from the teaching profession? And so the data that I will be using today comes from two studies that we conducted in 2006 and 2009, but in 12 countries in the region, but also with some of the synthesis of the more recent academic literature on teacher status and professionalism. But very briefly about the studies. So we have 12 countries. Kazakhstan was included in the second round of the private tutoring study. We surveyed about 12,000 students in higher education, in the first year of higher education, and we asked these students to reflect on their private tutoring practices in the last year of high school. And our idea was that the students probably would be more open and free to talk about private tutoring when they no longer use it, when they are already at the higher education level. And, but we also did policy analysis, interviews, and focus groups with teachers, tutors, and students as well. So we had both quantitative and qualitative data. And what we found was that in the last grade of secondary school, most of the students in the countries that were involved in the study, and these are also countries listed here, used private tutoring, right? And the percentages ranged from about 52% in Kyrgyzstan to more than 90% of students in Azerbaijan. So practically every student in Azerbaijan used private tutoring in the last year of their high school study before entering the university. And so I have Kazakhstan marked here, which was right in the middle, actually. And the different colors indicate the different types of private tutoring that the students engaged in. And so it was either private tutoring lessons or preparatory courses offered by institutions, or both types. Some students actually did engage in both types of private tutoring. And there were different reasons for why students were engaged in private tutoring, why they chose to do private tutoring in addition to their mainstream schooling. One of the reasons was that they used tutoring as an enrichment strategy, and that was directly linked to their ambition to get into the higher education. And the students' belief was that schools could not prepare students. So basically, the students simply would not be competitive enough if they went with the school curriculum. So they thought that they needed additional private tutoring to become more competitive and to pass university examinations. That was one of the reasons. Another reason was an overall perception of the low quality of education in their mainstream schools. And here both students and parents thought that simply mainstream schools don't give them enough of knowledge and skills, and they do need to be regularly supplemented by tutoring. And to some extent, some of this was linked to the introduction maybe of new subjects, of maybe dilution of the curriculum to some extent, but not all. And but it's also very interestingly, private tutoring was also seen as an income generation activity for teachers. And here both teachers and students talked about how the salaries of teachers often were so low that the only way for teachers to survive was to engage in private tutoring. And when we started digging more into this last point, and actually into all three of these points, we realized the centrality of teachers and teacher professionalism in this whole process of tutoring. So this is just some of the data to illustrate what I was talking about before. 63% of the students agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that one of the main reasons for private tutoring was for teachers to receive additional financial income. And actually many students talked about how often teachers even forced the students to engage in private tutoring, threatening that their marks would be lowered if they did not follow this teacher's suggestion. But there were other reasons too, and I want to talk about those other reasons too. The other reasons also were teachers kind of buying into this new logic of entrepreneurship that also began to circulate in the region. In fact, some of the education laws in the countries, like for example in Lithuania, even codified in the law that the teacher can be an entrepreneur in addition to his or her job in a public sphere, and outlined very specific steps about how a teacher can become a teacher/entrepreneur and how one can register for that, right? So it became possible to do freelance teaching, and in some countries it's not really frowned upon. but I think to me the important point was when we started speaking with teachers to try to understand why they engage in private tutoring, what we realized was that many of them also very personally were not happy with what was happening in their schools. Many of them felt that they lost their professional authority, that they're being told increasingly what to do, that teacher beliefs about the values of education are not necessarily reflected in some of the new legislation, educational legislation. For example, many teachers did talk about how they hated teaching to the test, or how they hated following the standards, how there were so many other values that they wanted to teach their students, but they simply had no time to do that in the state curriculum during the regular school hours. Many teachers did talk about how the curriculum became diluted and how they no longer have the time to teach very basic content that they thought was important. So they went to the private tutoring space to teach that content. So in a way, private tutoring for some teachers became the space almost of resistance, where they could correct what they thought public schools no longer were doing, whether it was emphasis on the content or sometimes individualized teaching that they felt that they have trouble providing in the public schools, or other issue. So in a way, they chose private tutoring as an opportunity to pursue alternative visions of education, where teachers, and not somebody else, were able to define what the values are, what is good education, and what they had the authority to plan the teaching process. And of course, this can be worrisome on the one hand, because it could be seen as a subversion of education reforms, but it also can be looked, I think, at very positively too, because we actually do see teacher professionalism redefined in this particular sense. And my colleagues, Simona Popa, for example, wrote about, and Clementina Cedo wrote about this. They interpreted it in this very empowering way as a process of private tutoring. They see it in terms of empowerment in an upbeat rather than defeatist fashion, where they see this illegal process of tutoring students as a little victory for teachers as individuals and as an occupational group, albeit on a very minor scale, by offering an alternative to union struggles and electoral politics as a model. It creates some kind of protected zone where teachers can experiment and do what they believe is right in education. And but at the same time, this remains a very individual endeavor, and it at the same time also undermines the occupationally anchored collectivity of teachers. And what I would even call, in a way, it almost looks like a privatization of teacher solidarity. There is some resistance to reform, or there is an ability for teachers to pursue their own visions of reform, but it's at such an individual level that it's not really making much difference. And so the reason why I wanted to talk about it today is that perhaps it's important for us also to understand why teachers are driven out of public education system, why they are looking for private tutoring in addition to their public school responsibilities, to understand the reasons behind it, and to perhaps also use this as an opportunity to really engage teachers in the conversation about reform on a much more serious level. You know, where we do take teacher opinions and values and beliefs seriously and use it to inform education policy and reform at the school level. Thank you.